Good day. Today is Wednesday, 11th February 2026, and let me remind you to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. If once having watched this video or whichever part of this video you want to watch, you decide that you like what you've heard and you wish to indicate that fact. Well, I make this program in the hours before what many are expecting to be yet another massive Russian drone and missile strike against Ukraine. There are reports of bombers assembling in air bases in Western Russia. There are reports also that hypersonic Kinjal missiles and hypersonic Zircon cruise missiles are going to be used. And of course, there will be KH-101s and KH-32s and Calibra missiles launched by the ships of the Black Sea Fleet. And there are also reports that this time Iskander ballistic missiles are going to be used as well. In other words, the entire range of Russian missiles, ballistic, subsonic cruise, hypersonic cruise, hypersonic air-launched missiles are all going to be launched against Ukraine over the course of the next big strike, which, as I said, is supposed to be taking place at some point tonight. And, well, Ukraine's energy system continues to be in deep crisis. I've not heard of any successful restoration of power to the electricity grid from the nuclear power plants. Perhaps something in that respect has been achieved, though I repeat again, I personally don't know about it. But there is no doubt that across the entire energy system in Ukraine, the situation continues to be critical. And as I discussed in a recent program, the Ukrainians themselves are acknowledging that their air defense system is in poor shape, that many of the Patriot missile batteries are now critically short of interceptor missiles, so that even if they can track the incoming Russian missiles and the hundreds of Duran drones which will accompany this strike, they're not in a position to shoot anything down because they don't have any missiles with which to do it. As I also discussed in a recent program, it seems that such air defense missile capability as Ukraine has left has been concentrated on the capital, on Kiev itself, with interceptor missiles being decanted from across Ukraine and transferred to Kiev to beef up the numbers of missiles there, and leaving the rest of the country basically short of air defense, except for some critical positions on the front lines. And by the way, the same is true of electricity supply. It seems that, again, in order to keep some electricity in the cities and fueling essential services, including, by the way, the nuclear power stations, electric power, perhaps more accurately, is being drained out of the system so that large areas of the Ukrainian countryside and many smaller towns and communities are basically deprived of power on a semi-permanent basis. That is my understanding of the current situation in Ukraine, and the pending attack, which looks as if it is indeed likely to happen fairly soon, is likely to make it much worse. There's always, of course, now the further possibility that the Russians might also launch one of their Oreshnik missiles, these enormously powerful hypersonic missiles with the multiple warheads, the 36 kinetic warheads that can do massive damage on an area basis, and which can perhaps, depending on which engineer you want to follow, can do serious damage to underground structures because of the earth tremors that these attacks cause. Anyway, it could be that the Russians might also use one of these Oreshnik missiles. There were some claims a few days ago that the Cosmodrome at Kapustin Yar, from which Oreshnik missile strikes on Ukraine up to now have been taking place. Anyway, there were reports that this Cosmodrome also looks like it is being prepared for an Oreshnik launch. Though Kapustin Yar is a very, very busy place, lots of missiles and rockets are tested there, and Kapustin Yar also, from time to time, launches satellites, mostly, I believe, for the Russian military. So activity at Kapustin Yar perhaps could have any number of other explanations. That the Ukrainians themselves are extremely concerned about the Oreshnik is confirmed, by the way, by reports which appeared a few days ago, about a week ago, that the Ukrainians have warned the Belarus authorities, the authorities of Belarus, the country located immediately to the north of Ukraine, that if there is a strike on Ukraine by Oreshnik missiles, using Oreshnik missiles, which are now based in Belarus, there are said to be 10 of them, 10 launchers of them, located in Belarus currently. The Ukrainians will regard that as an act of war and will treat Belarus as a belligerent party in the conflict. Anyway, for the record, Belarus provided the launching positions for the Russian advance towards Kiev from the north in February 2022. And the Ukrainians did not at that time treat that as a belligerent act by Belarus, though they would have had every legal right, as far as I know, to do so. The fact that they're coming up with these warnings now, to my mind, what it mostly shows is how nervous the Oreshnik makes them. And of course, they're aware that if there is an Oreshnik strike from Belarus, they will get even less warning than they will of an Oreshnik strike from Kapustin Yar, because Kapustin Yar is located hundreds of kilometers from Ukraine, whereas Belarus is, of course, right there on Ukraine's border. Anyway, we shall see what comes. But there's been some rather interesting facts that have already appeared about the crisis that these Russian attacks this winter are causing for Ukraine. And in particular, I read with great interest an article which has appeared in Responsible Statecraft, the website of the Quincy Institute, by Jennifer Kavanagh, who I have found one of the most intelligent and rational and insightful commentators about the Ukraine war, though someone who I would say also I don't always agree with, but then that's what one would expect. Jennifer Kavanagh, in this article, has floated the possibility that one of the reasons that the United States has so far failed to conduct its widely expected air and missile launch attack on Iran is because the United States, the military, the Pentagon, is seriously concerned about the critical shortage of air defense missiles. It seems, and I'm taking this again all from Jennifer Kavanagh's article, it seems that the United States, very much, by the way, as I had thought, has not been able, from current production, to make up the difference caused by the use of air defense missiles during the June 2025 12-day war between the United States, Israel, and Iran. And she asks why. She says that even if there is a general shortage of air defense missiles, how can it be possible that the United States has not at least taken some steps to restore its stockpiles? And this is what she says. Slow production timetables and the deep material debt mean that any effort to fully restore US stockpiles to the pre-2022 level will take time. But 8 months since the June 2025 12-day war should be sufficient to return stocks of some types of defense interceptors to less critical levels. If the defense missile cupboard is truly still bare, something else must be going on. That something else, it turns out, is Ukraine. And then the rest of Jennifer Kavanagh's article, whose title is What Happens When We Give Europe First Dibs on US Missiles for War? What is happening, according to this article, is that even though the United States apparently is no longer providing additional funding for Ukraine, the Europeans are continuing to buy weapons from Ukraine, for Ukraine, from the United States, first and foremost, Patriot missile interceptors. And there is also the further factor that the Ukrainians, using money provided by the Biden administration, are also still placing orders and receiving weapons, including Patriot missile interceptors from the United States, according to long-term contracts established during the period of the Biden administration. And because of the way in which these contracts are structured, and because of US government policy, which has not changed despite the change in administrations, and because of the heavy orders for further missile interceptors that the Europeans are placing on Ukraine's behalf, the United States, because it is currently only producing around 60 Patriot missile interceptors a month, that is Jennifer Kavanagh's figure, is unable to replenish its own stockpiles. Patriot missile interceptors are continuing to go disproportionately to Ukraine. Now, I have to say, I find this entirely plausible. It is very much what I would have expected. Brian Beletic, myself, others have discussed in many places the enormous difficulties that the United States is having in keeping up weapons supply. And we could see how this could be playing out in the way that it is. And Jennifer Kavanagh suggests that the continued drain of weapons, particularly air defense missile interceptors, to Ukraine is now having a significant effect in terms of US military capabilities and US ability to engage in, shall we say, aggressive operations in many places around the world. Now, I should say that I have heard some reports the production of Patriot missile interceptors has increased over the course of the last year, though I suspect not by a huge amount. But I will also add that if you go through Jennifer Kavanagh's article, you find that the source of her information, that the missile cupboard in in the United States, the air defense missile cupboard is basically bare, comes from a journalist called Eli Lake, who, to my absolute knowledge, is an extremely well-informed journalist about these kind of matters indeed, and who a journalist as well, whose views, as far as I can see, are essentially neocon, which rather lends authority to Jennifer Kavanagh's assertions. Well, the key point here is that Ukraine continues to drain the power of the United States, the military power of the United States, which might explain, by the way, American anxiety, urgency to end the war as soon as possible, the Ukraine war as soon as possible, in order to staunch this continuing bleed. But along the way, it does also mean that the United States, even as it does continue to supply both directly through older contracts and indirectly through the Europeans, Ukraine with air defense missiles, simply cannot keep up with Ukrainian needs. 60 Patriot missile interceptors a month, which according to Jennifer Kavanagh is the current rate of production, is not going to be enough to counter Russian missile strikes. The Russians can produce many more missiles than that, and as is well known, the Patriot missile system has to launch at least 2 missiles at each incoming missile to have any realistic possibility of striking the target. So, given that the Russians are launching many more missiles than that, 60 missiles against Ukraine each month, the United States simply cannot keep up with Ukrainian demands for air defense missiles. On this point, by the way, I should repeat again a point that I made in my previous program, that I don't understand anyway why the United States continues to supply Ukraine with Patriot missile systems in these quantities, given that it is widely acknowledged that the Patriot missile is not really able to do very much against some of the missiles that the Russians are now using. It cannot intercept the Oreshnik, and its chances of intercepting an incoming hypersonic Kinjal or Zircon missile are crushingly low. But anyway, that's the decision that the United States has made. One can understand, perhaps, the politics behind it. It may not make a huge amount of military or logistical or industrial sense, but somebody's doing well out of these contracts. Of that there is no doubt, and the administration anyway does not want to be seen not giving Patriot missile interceptors to Ukraine and turning the Europeans away. Anyway, that is one thing. Now, again, this episode highlights the enormous difference between the Russian industrial system and, I have to say this, the American industrial system. The United States struggles to produce Patriot missile interceptors. The Russians apparently have no difficulty increasing the numbers of their Kinjal missiles and Iskander ballistic missiles, and we're starting to see the Zircons used increasingly, and we can also see the Oreshnik now coming into serial production, with some reports saying that the Russians are able to produce 25 of these missiles each month. So we could see here again the enormous difference in industrial capabilities. And there is a report from the Estonian intelligence agencies, which, though very small, are apparently well regarded within NATO for their analytical abilities. Anyway, the Estonians are saying that Russian production of shells is now running at 7 million a year. When I say shells, I should make clear that this includes rockets for multiple launch rocket systems like the Tornado and the Grad, and mortar shells as well. But of course, this is ammunition used on the battlefronts, and we are now being given a figure of 7 million a year, much higher than the earlier estimates, and apparently given great credence within NATO and in Europe. And there's also further reports that the Russians are continuing to receive shells in huge quantities from North Korea, which could, of course, mean the total shell production, or rather total shell supplies to the Russian military, now are running at something like 10 million shells a year. I would not be myself surprised at that figure. Now, the Estonians are saying that the Russians are only using a fraction of these shells in the area of the special military operation. Instead, they are stockpiling. They are stockpiling perhaps for a potential Russia-NATO war, which is highly possible. But they might also be stockpiling in preparation for their big spring-summer offensive, which I have already said is coming. You can find all about this Estonian report about Russian shell production in the Financial Times. There is a report about it there, and well, you can draw your own conclusions and decide for yourself whether you think the report is true. I believe it is true, and I would also add that I believe that the Americans, for all kinds of reasons, often publish their findings about things like shell production in Russia via the Ukrainians rather than do so themselves. So my own guess is that this report is based on American intelligence. Anyway, there it is. So a massive Russian strike coming, Ukraine in no real position to absorb it, and the United States no longer in a position where it can change the situation. It is short of air defense interceptors itself, and that might be having an effect on its own actions close to Iran and in the Middle East. Now, there's also been a fair amount of information from the front lines, and the business of the Ukrainian counterattack in Zaporozhye is now becoming extremely intriguing, because we have the reverse of what usually happens. Usually it's the Ukrainians who talk about the successful Ukrainian counterattack, and the Russians who claimed that it is either exaggerated or has been repelled. This time it's the Russians who are saying that there has been a Ukrainian counterattack in eastern Zaporozhye region, though they do hastily say that it has been repelled, whereas some Ukrainian channels and bloggers are now saying that, in fact, there is no real Ukrainian counterattack in eastern Zaporozhye taking place at all. This is all hype. It's all media hype, which they attribute to the Russians, to a group of forces. I think it's south in this part of the front lines, that they're talking up this alleged Ukrainian counterattack. In reality, there has been no counterattack of any kind. Now, I think there was some kind of Ukrainian attack in eastern Zaporozhye. I think probably it did seek to capture or recapture the village of Ternovata, though there are some claims that this counterattack began as early as mid-January, and its existence has only been disclosed now, which contradicts the theory that the recapture of Ternopata was the objective, because Ternopata was only captured by the Russians, as far as I can remember, earlier this month. Just saying. But anyway, I think there was some kind of Ukrainian counterattack. The fact that some people on the Ukrainian side are now saying that this counterattack actually does not really exist, that it's merely hype, that provides me with further reasons to think that the counterattack was unsuccessful. The Ukrainians, incidentally, are now busy claiming that they've launched a completely different counterattack, but also in Zaporozhye, at the western end of Zaporozhye region, near to Zaporozhye city itself, and that they've recaptured a village called Lyubimovka, which was captured by General Teplinsky's group of forces Dnieper, and that they've recaptured part of the village of Primorske, which the Russians also claim to have captured, and which is located immediately to the south of Zaporozhye city. There is no video footage confirming any of this, and I have my doubts, but we'll just have to wait and see. To repeat again, if a Ukrainian attack in this place is taking place, its results will only be ephemeral. Elsewhere on the front lines, the Russian advances still continue, or do continue. The Russians have gained more ground close to Erechov itself in Zaporozhye region. They seem to have tightened their vice around the town of Belitska, north of Rodinska and Pokrovsk, and there is increasing speculation that the Russians are preparing for an assault on the logistical hub of Dobropilia, which is located to the northwest of Belitska. There's also been some map changes in terms of what's going on in Konstantinovka, showing further Russian advances there. My own view is that all of the maps have the situation in Konstantinovka mostly wrong, and that the Russians are present in much more of this town than people believe. But again, of course, I am not there, and we'll just have to wait and see. And everybody acknowledges that the Russians are moving faster and faster west of Siversk towards the important city of Slavyansk, and taking in the town of Alexandrovka, which still stands in their way, and that fighting in Liman remains very intense, and that the situation there for the Ukrainians is becoming very critical. There's also, by the way, been video footage from Kupiansk, the city of Kupiansk itself, which again appears to show Russian soldiers across large areas of northern Kupiansk, which the Ukrainians claim to have recaptured in their recent, much talked about and much discussed counteroffensives. It could be, of course, that those counteroffensives did take place, that the Ukrainians did recapture these territories, and that the Russians have now moved back and have retaken control. That is one theory, but I personally prefer the simpler explanation, which is that the Russians have always been there all along, exactly as they themselves have always insisted. Again, in Kupiansk, virtually everybody, all the mappers, now accept that the areas under Ukrainian control close to Kupiansk on the east bank of the Oskol River have been almost entirely cleared and captured by the Russians, and that the Russians will soon be in complete control of all territory and positions on the Oskol River's eastern bank, meaning that the cauldron that was apparently created east of Kupiansk is about to be extinguished. Now, it would not be fair to omit the fact that the Ukrainians have themselves carried out attacks on Russia over the last 24 hours. There's been significant drone strikes or attempted drone strikes against the famous city of Volgograd on the Volga River, better known to many people as Stalingrad. The Russian Defense Ministry claims that this attack was mostly repelled, though it does seem as if some drones got through. And the Ukrainians continued their shelling and drone attacks on the border city, the Russian border city of Belgorod. And here the situation does seem to be much more difficult. But these Ukrainian attacks on Russia, as I have discussed many times, have marginal effect on the gigantic Russian economy and on a country which is the biggest country in the world, whereas the Russian attacks on Ukraine are quite simply devastating. Anyway, that's the situation on the front lines and in the sky. Now, the Financial Times late yesterday and early this morning published a very strange article claiming that under severe pressure from the United States to push forward with some kind of diplomatic solution, Zelensky has been discussing with his senior officials plans to announce a referendum on a peace agreement and a presidential election. The announcement supposedly was to be made on the 24th of February, which happens to be the 4th anniversary of the start of the special military operation, with plans to conduct this election and this referendum in May. Now, I have to say, the moment I read that article in the Financial Times, which has been circulated and commented about by many people in many places, and again, many people have accepted it as true. Anyway, the moment I read that article, I was extremely suspicious. Zelensky has consistently rejected demands that he call elections and that he call a referendum. He has always insisted that this can only happen in conditions of a ceasefire. And in fact, it has been one of his key arguments for demanding a ceasefire on the existing conflict line, which the Russians, of course, have repeatedly rejected. Besides, for Zelensky to call an election and a referendum now, when his popularity is sinking, when much of Ukraine is without electric power, when there are protests about the energy situation in many Ukrainian cities, with particularly big protests, so understand, in the city of Dnipro and the cities of Dnipro and Kryvyi Rog, but no doubt also in other places. I've seen rumors that there are also protests in Odessa, but I haven't seen any video footage. Anyway, it seemed to me most unlikely that Zelensky, who has been clinging on to his position as president of Ukraine, would be in any mood to announce such an election or referendum at this time. And sure enough, a few hours after all of these reports appeared, there was an article in the Kiev Independent, which says that Zelensky won't announce elections on war anniversary amid talks of US-driven timetable. Source says, as of now, President Zelensky does not plan to announce presidential elections or a referendum on a possible peace deal with Russia on February 24th. A source in the president's office familiar with the matter told the Kiev Independent on February 11th. And then there's a comment, then the Kiev Independent refers to the Financial Times article, but the source, who might of course be Zelensky himself, says he wasn't planning to. When there's no security, there is nothing else. And if the Russians are killing people every day, how can we announce or seriously consider elections in the coming weeks? No one is against elections, but there must be security. In other words, there must be a ceasefire. This is a strange story, by the way, and I'm going to express my own view that that article in the Financial Times probably came from an American source. It is the Americans who are pressing very hard for Zelensky to call elections or a referendum as a way to break the deadlock in the peace talks and to move forward with the negotiations. The United States has denied that they have a deadline. Zelensky claimed a few days ago that they wanted an end to the fighting in June. As I discussed in my program yesterday, Matthew Whitaker, the US's ambassador to NATO, said that the United States has never announced or communicated to any party that it has such a deadline. But I have no doubt that the US does indeed want to end the war as quickly as it can. Basically, now for two urgent reasons which go well beyond the great geostrategic one of transferring troops from Europe to face China and all of that. Two compelling reasons. The first is that the Pentagon, as we've seen, is running out of critical weapon systems, namely air defense missiles. And the second one is, of course, the midterm elections in November. So the Americans want to find some way to break the deadlock. For some reason, which I don't myself know, they seem to believe that Zelensky calling elections and a referendum in Ukraine is going to be the way to achieve it. Maybe they hope that Zelensky will lose the election and be replaced by someone more pliable. If that is what they believe, I think they are in every respect wrong. I think that Zelensky, for one thing, will ensure that he wins whatever election he calls. He is far too deep in now to risk losing an election. Just saying. And so, by the way, are his European backers. They will pull out every stop to make sure that Zelensky comes out the winner. You could say that they will do whatever it takes to ensure that. And at the same time, I cannot imagine if Zelensky were replaced by anyone in Ukraine, anyone in Kiev, out of the political class in Kiev, that they would take a different stance on the war than the one Zelensky himself has been taking. I've been reading some interviews that the mayor of Kiev, Mayor Klitschko, has been giving, and as far as I can see, despite the fact that he proclaims himself Zelensky's opponent, on the ending of the war, on the conduct of the war itself, he is every bit as hardline as is Zelensky himself. He even made the preposterous claim that Putin's ultimate objective is to re-establish the East German Democratic Republic. In other words, to divide Germany again. So I don't know why the Americans think that elections or a referendum in Ukraine are going to change anything. I don't believe they will, but they floated this possibility through this article in the Financial Times. and Zelensky has just shot it down. Now, he hasn't just been shooting down proposals to conduct referendums. We have had that actual shooting, the one that took place in Moscow a few days ago, the one which resulted in the critical wounding of General Alexeyev, the second in command at Russian military intelligence, whose overall commander, Admiral Kostyukov, is Russia's chief negotiator in the only talks that are taking place at the moment between Russia and Ukraine, with rumors, reports in the Russian media, especially Russian social media, that Alexeyev himself was also one of the negotiators. Now, there continues to be, in some places in the West, denials that it was the Ukrainians who were behind the shooting. This despite the fact that the Russians have now straightforwardly alleged this. Now, I have to say, I've been going through all of the evidence that the Russians have provided. We've had public confession statements by Kolba, the alleged assassin or attempted assassin. He not only admits his role, but he also explains that he was offered $30,000 in return for a successful killing of the target, in other words, General Alexeyev, and he's provided some further evidence as well. I am very uncomfortable about basing any assumptions on such a confession statement. I don't know how it was obtained, though Kolba himself, I ought to say, over the course of it, did seem to me to be in good health and fairly well composed. But anyway, let's put that aside. The Russians have also released footage of the assassination itself. They've shown the assassin concealing the pistol that was used to try to carry out the killing. I've seen that. I've seen other footage, including footage of some of the accomplices, the Vazins, father and son. The son, it seems, was also implicated, as well as the father. Both of them, for the record, heavily involved in Russia's liberal opposition, and at one time in the past, supporters of Alexei Navalny, though one should not draw any specific conclusions from that fact, but certainly people who have a very clear record of strong anti-government activity and opinions within Russia. Anyway, in summary, I found the case that the Russians are bringing overwhelmingly strong and entirely convincing. And I say this putting aside Kolba's statement. It seems to me that the facts now mostly speak for themselves. And I notice that the Russians are saying that the agency that was directing and which was behind this assassination was indeed the SBU, Ukraine's counterintelligence agency, which also conducts operations in Russia, General Poklad's organization, just to say, not Budanov's military intelligence. And, well, it does seem to me that, as I said, all of the evidence stacks up and is consistent with what the Russians have been saying. Now, the Russians have not yet taken any obvious counter steps against the Ukrainians arising from this attack. Lavrov, as I have said, has now made a whole succession of extremely hardline statements. He made more yesterday, by the way, but I'm not going to go over them because it seems to me that they don't break any new ground. He did say, just to say that he did say that all Russians in Ukraine would achieve liberation, though which could be taken fairly extensively. I mean, that could certainly encompass places like Kiev, like Kiev, and of course Odessa as well. But he stopped short of saying that, and he still seemed to be talking about the four regions. Anyway, I'm not going to go over Lavrov's further statements. I've covered the things that Lavrov has been saying in two consecutive programs now. Another senior Russian diplomat, went in some ways even further than Lavrov did. He appeared to confirm a point that I made in a program recently when I said that it seemed to me that the Russians were in the process of hardening their terms, that they are now demanding a revision of the entire security architecture in Europe as a condition for ending the conflict. This diplomat, whose name, by the way, I forget, but this diplomat, very senior diplomat, actually said that not only should Ukraine receive security guarantees, but Russia, as part of a peace agreement, must receive security guarantees also. Security guarantees that will confirm Ukraine's neutral status, its position outside NATO, security guarantees that will provide Russia with a veto on foreign troop deployments in Ukraine and the basing of foreign troops in Ukraine, and security guarantees which will ensure complete security for Russia's western borders. And this very senior diplomat, he holds, from memory, a rank of deputy foreign minister, went on to say that unless this is formally agreed and enshrined in a peace agreement, there will be no peace agreement, with the implication that the war will go on. Now that does seem to me a very hard line, and possibly the Russians were prepared to ease off on some of that in Anchorage, but they seem to be restating that demand now. And it segues in very well to a further Russian demand for a reconfiguration of the security architecture in Europe. And by the way, one of the things that Lavrov has said over the last 24 hours is that once the Russians achieve their objectives in Ukraine, once the four regions have been reunited with Russia, as he would say, once all of the other terms of the agreement, denuclearization, disarmament, neutral status, the full restoration of rights of Russians and of the Orthodox Church on Ukrainian territory. Once all of that is achieved, it will seamlessly flow into further discussions for a reconstitution of the entire security architecture in Europe. That clearly now is a Russian objective, and the Russians are saying this straightforwardly. They're no longer taking steps to conceal it. So it does seem to me that the Russians are indeed hardening their positions, and as I've already said in many places, I cannot imagine any circumstance where the United States and the Europeans agree to this complete reconstruction of the security architecture in Europe that the Russians do now seem to be demanding. And this does, it seems to me, narrow radically the prospects of a negotiated peace. Meanwhile, the Europeans have their own agenda. Kaya Kallas has come up with another one of her remarkable proposals. She says that the European Union, even as it considers the possibility of itself resuming some kind of dialogue with the Russians, intends to draw up its own demands. And these are demands which the Russians need to agree to in order for there to be a proper return to peace. And central amongst these demands is that the Russians must reduce the size of their armed forces. Kaya Kallas explains that the issue is not the size of Ukraine's armed forces. Ukraine should be allowed to have however big an army it wants. It is Russia that must agree to reduce radically the size of its armed forces and presumably its capabilities as well. She has, of course, in the past called for Russia to be deprived entirely of its nuclear weapons capability. Well, my initial view when I read all of that was Kaya Kallas, dream on. There is no way, obviously, that the Russians are going to agree to any of that. Again, it all seems to be based on the fantastic hypothesis that the Russians are losing the war, are under extraordinary stress, even as they outproduce the entire collective West in production of shells. In fact, they're producing many more shells than the entire collective West is doing, and even as they outproduce the West in pretty much every other sector of defense production. Anyway, Kaya Kallas presumably still clings on to these comforting fantasies of Russian exhaustion and pending Russian collapse, because it was the only way that these fantastic demands that she is coming up with could ever be implemented in practice is a circumstance where Russia is defeated in war and capitulates. That, of course, is also a fantasy which is never going to happen. Now, the big unanswerable question, where Kaya Kallas is concerned, is whether she realizes that, whether these proposals are made in earnest, or whether, as I think perhaps more likely, she's making these impossible demands, not because she seriously expects that the Russians will ever agree to them. The Russians will never accept demands of this kind from Kaya Kallas. They won't accept even far less extravagant demands from Kaya Kallas, because, as they surely know, Kaya Kallas is on record as saying that the ultimate, optimal objective should be the breakup and disintegration of Russia entirely. And that is almost by definition going to make the Russians, shall we say, intensely skeptical of any proposal that she puts forward. But anyway, I suspect that the real reason she's making these impossible demands is because she doesn't want to see any kind of dialogue or peace agreement between the Europeans and the Russians at all. And she thinks that by making fantastic demands of this kind, well, the Russians will refuse to talk and the negotiations will never get off the ground. Her adversary and rival here, by the way, continues to be Emmanuel Macron. In the last year now of his presidency, or almost the last year of his presidency, he again is saying that the Europeans need to start a dialogue with the Russians. He says it was everything that the Europeans have done up to this point really can't be faulted or criticized, or the massive array of sanctions, the diplomatic boycott of Russia, all of that presumably was absolutely correct. But now at this point in time, for reasons that Macron doesn't really ever quite explain, now at this point in time, the resumption of some kind of dialogue is necessary, and that the technical, as he puts it, the technical ability to conduct such a dialogue between France and Russia is now once again in place. Presumably the technical ability is that somebody in Moscow has given him Putin's telephone number, because as the Russians have repeatedly pointed out, all that Macron ever needed to do in order to get a dialogue with Putin resumed was to pick up the telephone and call him. But anyway, I'm not going to speculate on this, nor am I going to speculate further on the possibility that Macron might have visited Moscow in secret without us knowing about it. But anyway, Macron and Callas are at odds over this. But for the moment at least, despite her own tensions with EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who Callas has, by the way, in a rather extraordinary interview referred to as a dictator. Anyway, for the moment at least, Callas does seem to speak for the European leadership, and I suspect that she still carries more traction in terms of policy than Macron himself does. Anyway, the other thing that suggests to me that there is still absolutely no intention really in Europe of moving forward with any kind of negotiation with the Russians is that the European Commission is now coming up with another cunning plan to get its hands on the frozen Russian assets in Euroclear. Now, I discussed this at fantastic length before the start of the year, when Ursula von der Leyen and Friedrich Merz had come up with a plan to float a loan on the international markets, a 140 billion euro loan from memory, which would be secured on the frozen Russian assets held in Euroclear, and with the interest on the bonds being paid out of the interest generated by the assets, and, well, the loan eventually being repaid out of the assets themselves when the Russians capitulated and agreed to pay reparations. I discussed at tremendous length how there is no legal basis, none whatsoever, for this operation, that the assets are indisputably Russian. Nobody, not even the Europeans, doubt this, that the fact that this is a scheme highlights again the illegality of that proposal. And of course, Euroclear, the International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank, and most vocally, the Prime Minister of Belgium, Bart de Wever, all said that this is illegal and wrong and cannot happen in that way. And eventually, when the French and the Italians backed Bart de Wever on this in December, the entire project to misuse the assets, to misappropriate the assets in this way, collapsed. Even as the Russians, by the way, have started legal proceedings. Well, the new plan is every bit as ingenious and even more illegal than the old one. I say even more illegal because this is what is now being proposed. The European leadership, Merz, Ursula, presumably Callas, all of the others, now realise that Euroclear and the Belgian government will never agree to this proposal, any sort of proposal for a misappropriation of the assets. So the idea is this: take the assets out of Euroclear, transfer them to an entirely new bank, which is going to be created by the European Union itself, and then presumably rerun the entire project that failed last year all over again, but telling everybody, telling the world, telling the Belgians, telling Euroclear, there's no need to worry. Euroclear itself isn't involved. We are indeed using the assets in the illegal way that we said, but you can't blame Euroclear for this, and you can't blame the Belgians for this, because the money is no longer held by Euroclear and is no longer in Belgium. Now, this is actually worse from a legal point of view than the previous proposal, because what it means is taking money out of a bank in which the Russians placed it without the Russians' permission. And that is a straightforward misappropriation. I mean, think about what is being proposed. What is being proposed is that you take money out of a bank, you steal the money from the bank, because obviously the party that placed the money in the bank has not been informed and does not agree. So you steal the money out of the bank and transfer it to another bank, which you create yourself, except it isn't really a bank at all, actually. It's just some kind of cash box, so that you can help yourself to it later. I mean, this is even more blatant misappropriation, or theft if you prefer, than the proposal that was made last year. To repeat again, a point I have made many times, if you can't simply help yourself to the assets, if you have to come up with elaborate and complicated schemes of this kind, you are not finding ways round the fact that you are misappropriating the assets. All that you are doing is exposing your own knowledge of the illegality of the maneuver that you are carrying out. If it was not illegal, or if you didn't believe it was illegal, you would just do it without carrying out schemes of this kind. But anyway, the Europeans are now busy coming up with this plan. What Euroclear and the Belgian government will say, by the way, just for the record, I believe that they would be every bit as much on the hook for this as if the money was simply taken out of Euroclear in the way that was proposed in December. I can't see how, if they are complicit with this kind of manoeuvre, their liability is any the less, just saying. But anyway, coming back to this, I don't know what they're all going to say and what they're going to do, but the fact that they're talking in this way at all shows again how they remain obsessed with these funds in Euroclear, and how, frankly, they are not sincerely thinking about negotiations with the Russians or about peace. Now, I'm just going to finish here by saying that I suspect that the reason this proposal is coming up now is that the Europeans are now starting to confront the reality that the 90 billion euro loan proposal that was agreed in December is also unworkable. It's supposed to be based on bonds placed in the financial markets from the basically structured as to raise funding for the European budget. But as I've already said, there is no clear explanation to those who are going to be asked to buy these bonds how they're ever going to be repaid. And unless the European governments are prepared to give money to the European Union to cover these loans, or give guarantees for these loans, all of which would probably require approval by member state parliaments, which might be difficult and controversial. I really cannot myself understand how this loan is going to work unless the Europeans are prepared to pay extravagantly high rates of interest on it, which could only cause a whole set of different problems. So I suspect that Kallas and Ursula and probably Merz have now been told all of this, and they've told, look, if you are going to go ahead with this 90 billion euro loan, and you've told Zelensky that you've sorted out all of the issues between yourselves about how this loan is going to be used. So you don't have any further excuse not to provide the Ukrainians with this money that you've told them you will give them. Well, if you're going to provide this loan, you've got to come up with some explanation to the future bondholders about how you intend to repay them. And as European leaders do not want to go to European parliaments, the parliaments of the member states, to have all this discussed, they're now drifting back to ideas about using the Russian frozen assets instead. Now, there is going to be a consequence to all of this legally at some point, regardless of what happens. I understand that the Russian case that they started in Moscow is still underway and is moving through its various stages. I do believe that the Russians have brought other claims in other places as well, and I have it on the best authority that they are indeed preparing, once they get their judgment in Moscow, to move forward with a further case, probably in Singapore, and by setting up one of these tribunals that the various treaties enable them to set up. So there will be a legal reckoning eventually. But in the meantime, Ursula Merz have this problem of this loan hanging over them, and it seems to me that they are desperately looking for ways to seize the Russian assets in order to make the loan work. Now, again, to repeat, if something like this were to happen, then I cannot imagine that negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians and the Europeans could continue. And frankly, I suspect that this is something that Kallas and Ursula and Merz know perfectly well. And they're either pressing ahead with this plan because, from their point of view, the issue of raising the loan is more pressing, or also because they want the negotiations, the ongoing talks in Abu Dhabi and elsewhere to fail anyway. It's just that they want to blame the Russians for that failure. So anyway, I don't really see any movement on the European side at all. The Europeans, by the way, are all over the place on everything. For about the last, I think it's about 10 years, there's been an ongoing project in Europe to start to develop a new fighter jet, a new fifth generation fighter jet. This has been talked about by the French and the Germans. It looks as if it's about to collapse in acrimony. There is talk about Germany going it alone. I don't believe the Germans can go it alone. They haven't produced a fighter jet since the end of the Second World War. The idea that they can leap from Messerschmitts all the way to fifth generation fighters, I think, well, it's a leap too far, even for a technologically advanced country like Germany, just to say. And I don't believe the Germans have those capabilities. I think the French obviously do have capabilities to produce fighter jets, but I don't believe they are capable of producing fifth generation fighters. What makes this all even more absurd is that there are rumours. Well, there is definite information that the United States is already moving forward with sixth generation fighters. And there are reports that China, and by the way, Russia, are moving with sixth generation fighters as well. But suffice to say that even this project wasn't able to get off the ground. And with every day that passes, the situation in Europe gets weaker and worse. And to the extent that Britain should still be considered a part of Europe, as, by the way, arguably it should. Well, I've already discussed the political crisis in Britain. Late yesterday, there were admissions from Prime Minister Starmer's officials communicated to the media in London that Prime Minister Starmer is too weak now to sack a cabinet minister, Wes Streeting, even though everybody can see that Wes Streeting is busy plotting to oust Starmer so that he can get Starmer's job. The only reason why Starmer remains in place, in my opinion, is that other potential rivals, people who want to replace him, people like Angela Rayner and perhaps Andy Burnham, for their own reasons. In the first case, in Rayner's case, issues about her tax affairs. In Burnham's case, the fact that he is not yet a member of the House of Commons, stand in their way and mean that they want to delay an election for new Labour leader to give themselves time to stand. And they also probably recognise that if Starmer were to fall tomorrow, almost by default, Streeting, who has none of these problems at the moment, would become leader in Starmer's place. Though I should say I don't know a single individual who thinks that Streeting would do a better job than Starmer. And I've seen opinion polls which suggest that Streeting, as it happens, is even more unpopular than Starmer is, and that a Streeting-led Labour Party and Labour government would do even worse in any election than a Starmer-led Labour Party would do. But anyway, the point is that Britain, in effect, doesn't have a government or a prime minister. The business of government, the real serious business of government, is not being done. Obviously, the formalities continue to happen. Cabinet meetings still take place. Ministers turn up in the House of Commons and answer questions, though probably that is extremely uncomfortable for them to do. But the entire bandwidth of the government is now devoted to speculation about when Starmer himself will step down and who will take his place. There is no other topic that interests the political class in London at the moment other than that. And in face of that, not only is the government unable to make key decisions on critical questions like the state of the economy, but obviously it is not able to make any changes whatsoever to British policy over Project Ukraine. To do that, Britain would need an actual, real, effective Prime Minister, confident in his or her own position. And for the moment, and probably for the fairly long term, Britain doesn't have one. So anyway, there we are. The Europeans are all over the place. I get the sense that the Americans are now more focused anyway on the Middle East, and I do believe that the interest in Ukraine will indeed start to fade as the midterms approach. There is now, as I've said, universal consensus that the Russians are preparing their major offensive in Ukraine in the spring and summer. And everybody can see what the proximate targets are, objectives are. I say the proximate objectives, not the ultimate objectives. The proximate objectives are Zaporozhye, the whole of Zaporozhye, including Zaporozhye city, and the whole of Donbass, including the line of fortified cities we've been hearing so much about, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Druzhivka, and Konstantinovka. The ultimate military objectives, in my opinion, continue to be ultimately the recapture of Odessa and of the entirety of Ukraine's Black Sea coast. After all, isn't Lavrov now talking about the need to protect the rights of Russians right across Ukraine? And also, I suspect, Kiev itself, where, for one thing, the Russians will probably want to replace the current Ukrainian government and regime with another. But I accept that it may be that these ultimate objectives are not achievable this year, though with the pace of collapse in Ukraine as high as it currently is, with the cities plunged in darkness, with the energy system in crisis, with the army, the Russian army, now closer and coming closer and closer to the last big lines of defense in Donbass and Zaporozhye. There's I would have thought, real possibility that even this year, these ultimate objectives might be within Russia's reach. But anyway, that I think is mostly what we need to focus on. More likely than not, the high point of American interest in achieving a negotiated settlement in Ukraine will come this summer and then will decline sharply after. Of course, if the Democrats recapture either one or possibly both of the two houses of Congress, the battle in the United States will move to domestic issues, and the President, Donald Trump, will have less freedom to take initiatives, be it on Ukraine, the Middle East, or any other matter, just to say. And in the meantime, I think the Russians have probably, judging from what Lavrov is saying, already concluded that the negotiation route is leading nowhere, and every indication remains that they're going to focus more on the war. For the record, my own speculation is that sometime later this month, we're going to have the next big briefing to Putin from his generals, televised and provided to us by the Kremlin. We will see what the generals report to him, and, well, one way or the other, the attention will from this time on once again start to be more on the war. So this is where I finish my program today. There's continued stories and reports about what's happening in the scandal in the United States involving Epstein. There's also, of course, the extremely dangerous situation in the Middle East. President Trump is meeting Prime Minister Netanyahu. We will see what comes there. But those are topics for another day. This is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X, as well as Substack, links under this video. Please remember also that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links also under this video. And also please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.